Is there a discrepancy between Stephen and the book of Genesis concerning how many people went down to Egypt? This is the question we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Acts on Walking Through the Bible. Today we're going to be discussing Acts 7 verses 9 to 16, but before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, turn to Acts chapter 7 verse 9, but if you don't have a Bible, don't worry, just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So Acts chapter 7, beginning at verse 9. And the patriarchs, becoming envious, sold Joseph into Egypt. But God was with him, and delivered him out of all his troubles, and gave him favor and wisdom in the presence of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And he made him governor over Egypt and all his house. Now a famine and great trouble came over all the land of Egypt and Canaan, and our fathers found no sustenance. But when Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, he sent out our fathers first. And the second time Joseph was made known to his brothers, and Joseph's family became known to Pharaoh. Then Joseph sent and called his father Jacob and all his relatives to him, 75 people. So Jacob went down to Egypt, and he died, he and our fathers. And they were carried back to Shechem, and laid in the tomb that Abraham bought for a sum of money from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem. Stephen is standing before the Jewish council on trumped-up charges of blasphemy for supposedly speaking against the temple in Jerusalem and getting the Jews to turn their back on the law of Moses by preaching Jesus. In his sermon to the council, Stephen begins by going back all the way to Abraham and God appearing to Abraham in Mesopotamia. He did this to show that God appeared to Abraham long before there was a temple in Jerusalem, and his promises preceded the law of Moses. This is an important point to make for Stephen if he is going to refute these charges. God appearing to Abraham before the temple shows us that God did not live in temples made with hands, and even though his presence would have been found in the Jerusalem temple for a period of time, he did not live there either. Thus, even though the Jews misunderstood Jesus' meaning about destroying the temple, for in that he referred to his death, even if the temple was destroyed, God was not losing a home. That God appeared to Abraham before the law of Moses made his promises to Abraham before the law of Moses, and brought in circumcision before the law of Moses. And this shows us that the law of Moses isn't what made one a child of God, for the law was never intended to be permanent. Yet, even if the Jews misunderstood this point, the fact remains that Jesus didn't destroy the law of Moses. He fulfilled it and then took it out of the way, for Moses spoke of him and this fact. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, for Stephen is continuing his history that will lead to Moses. After Abraham had Isaac, Isaac had Jacob, and Jacob had the 12 patriarchs. The entire family, though, still lived in Canaan. But God had prophesied to Abraham that his descendants wouldn't inherit Canaan until they served another nation for 400 years and then be brought back to Canaan. How would God accomplish this? Well, of course, God used human events to bring about his purpose. When the patriarchs became envious of their brother Joseph, they sold Joseph into Egypt. God didn't cause the patriarchs to do this, for God could have used any way to accomplish his purpose, but God used the sin of the patriarchs to advance his purpose here. While in Egypt, God was with Joseph and gave him favor and wisdom in the presence of Pharaoh. Even here we see the hand of God working, for remember how Joseph obtained his position. It was because God sent dreams to the baker and butler of Pharaoh while they were imprisoned. The butler, who was later freed, eventually remembered Joseph, who had interpreted his dream. And when Pharaoh had a dream that couldn't be interpreted, Joseph was called out of prison to do so, by the power of God, of course. The dream of Pharaoh was that a famine would come for 7 years after 7 good years of plenty had come. Joseph was put in charge of preparing for this famine, basically was made prime minister. It was the famine that caused Jacob and his family to move to Egypt, gaining good land in the land of Goshen because of the position of Joseph. Verse 14 of Acts said that when Jacob came down to Egypt, 75 people was the number of his family. Back in Genesis 46, verses 26 and 27, we read, All the persons who went with Jacob to Egypt, who came from his body besides Jacob's sons' wives, were 66 persons in all. And the sons of Joseph, who were born to him in Egypt, were 2 persons. All the persons of the house of Jacob, who went to Egypt, were 70. How many grandchildren does Joseph have? He had 5. And so if you add 70 and 5 together, you get 75. That Joseph's grandchildren would be included in this number is not out of place, because some of the grandchildren of Judah through Perez are included. Remember, children got married and had children much younger than they do today, so Ephraim and Manasseh must have had these children not long after Jacob and his family came to Egypt, which is why they were included in that count. And since this section of Stephen's sermon was really about God's providence worked through Joseph, that is why he quoted the number here as well. This section concludes, though, by saying that Joseph wasn't buried in Egypt, but was buried in the tomb that Jacob bought from the sons of Hamor in Shechem. We saw this fulfilled in Joshua 24. Verse 16 of Acts 7 seems to contain a scribal error, for it says Abraham bought the tomb from the sons of Hamor, whereas from Genesis 33 we know that it was Jacob who bought this. From my research, it appears that the reason for this error is because Luke does not use a name, simply saying he bought the tomb in the original. And so by mistake, a future scribe inserted Abraham there, a mistake that is filtered on down to the present-day translations, because that's what the ancient manuscripts that we have literally says. It is not a problem for us, because we recognize that there were some scribal errors, though not many when compared to the vastness of Scripture, following the original writing of the New Testament, which was without error. None of these scribal errors, though, affect any doctrine of Scripture, and the true meaning of the passage can be ascertained by reading the whole body of Scripture, so we can know what the original writer actually said. We'll continue with more of Stephen's sermon, the Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Acts chapter 7, verses 17 to 29, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.